Hello everyone, Hamish here once again. I hope you're well. Today I'm going to be diving back into the world of philosophy. This is another philosophical glimpse episode, and although I haven't done any of these in over a year now, I'm really eager to be getting back into it. I love philosophy. It informs just about every part of my thinking, every day of my life, and I would be delighted if I could communicate some of these ideas to you. Some of them are quite dense, some of them are out of my reach, but I'll do my very best, and I hope you enjoy what I have to say. The topic of today's video is an essay by Schopenhauer entitled On the Suffering of the World. It's contained within this volume of essays and aphorisms, which I bought on a whim from a bookstore maybe a year and a half ago. It then sat on my shelf for over a year, until one day, for some reason or other, I summoned the will to pick it up, and I gave it a read as I went to school that morning on the train. It was a memorable trip, and I think it will be for a while to come, because I discovered Schopenhauer to be one of my favorite philosophers. I was struck straight away by just how vivid and immediate and relatable his philosophy is. There are lots of philosophers out there who can discuss abstract realities, but I think it takes a great philosopher to be able to translate that abstract reality into a human reality. And that's what Schopenhauer does so well. I see his concepts reflected in my everyday life, and that just means so much more to me than your kind of high-flying, detached philosopher might. So what do I know about Arthur Schopenhauer? Well, not all that much, to be honest. He was born in 1788. He was a Prussian man. I read in a short biography of his that his life tended to be quite miserable, and that might go some way to explaining the nature of his philosophy. Schopenhauer is often associated with the field of philosophical pessimism, and you can probably work out what that means. It's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, if you've got the path of philosophy, you follow that path long enough and you get to this juncture where you've stripped away all the artifices and conventions of the world, or at least so I imagine. I haven't got that far along the path, and you're there to make the decision for yourself whether reality is good or bad. Schopenhauer decisively took the path saying that the world is bad, and he has very good reasons for doing this. In fact, some of his reasons might upset your own view of reality, as they have mine to a degree. Of course, saying that the world is bad is an ethical judgment, but Schopenhauer starts from a metaphysical position, which I'm not going to explain today. Hopefully I can in the future. Suffice to say that he's coming after Immanuel Kant, who revolutionized the world of metaphysics with this old thing, Critique of Pure Reason. There's not even a crease in the spine. I wonder why that might be. Schopenhauer took many of Kant's ideas, and it seems that he kind of continued where Kant left off. Kant discussed this division between the phenomenal world, which is the world of appearance, and the noumenal world, which is the world in itself. And Schopenhauer then added a little something to it, a little something called the will, which is really nebulous to me. I'm not going to try to explain that either. He also started making ethical judgments from the basis of his metaphysics. With all that being said, let's now turn to the essay itself, On the Suffering of the World. Unsurprisingly, you can get a fairly clear idea about what this is from the title. This whole essay is centered on a definitive point, that man's existence is naturally geared towards suffering. Although suffering seems to us to be the exception or an aberration to the general rule of life, which sees life as being good, in fact it's the other way around. Life is defined by grief and toil and calamity and want, and it's the moments of pleasure or joy that are actually exceptional, and they are also quite delusory between you and me. So, how does Schopenhauer argue this? Well, first we've got to look at the way he defines suffering, and I really like this. According to Schopenhauer, suffering occurs when our will has been thwarted. Sounds straightforward enough, but in order to further illustrate it, he uses this great simile. I'll quote from Schopenhauer here. Just as a stream flows smoothly on as long as it encounters no obstruction, so the nature of man and animal is such that we never really notice or become conscious of what is agreeable to our will. If we are to notice something, our will has to have been thwarted. And so we're like the stream. As long as our will is satisfied, we just float along, barely noticing anything. But the moment we come up to an obstacle, suddenly we become violent and ruffled. And that, in Schopenhauer's view, is the source of suffering and grief. Now, a few problems arise from this. The biggest one being that our will is inevitably going to be thwarted in the course of our life. Therefore, suffering is inevitable. It's not something we can escape. We can't just overleap that boulder in the stream. We've got to slam against it, and it's got to, have us all agitated. It's just part of life. Moreover, there is something in our essential nature which causes us to fixate upon this obstruction in our course, which causes us to fixate upon suffering itself. And this is really unfortunate, but it's something we can all relate to. Schopenhauer explains it like this. Just as we are conscious not of the healthiness of our whole body, but only of the little place where the shoe pinches, so we think not of the totality of our successful activities, but of some insignificant trifle or other which continues to vex us. This line really, really hit me the first time I read it. For one thing, I was in a pair of shoes that were too tight, and I had been fretting about that, but it just caused me to realize, my God, I'm not noticing the fact that all the rest of my body is in good working order. I'm noticing something as minute as my toe. That's where my attention is being drawn. And that's one of the most compelling arguments that Schopenhauer makes, really. There's something in our nature which causes us just to focus on the minutiae, that word, causes us to focus on the minutiae of suffering instead of the broad picture of our health or our contentment. Following the idea that human nature is more absorbed by pain than pleasure, Schopenhauer uses this example. A quick test of the assertion that enjoyment outweighs pain in this world, or that they are at any rate balanced, would be to compare the feelings of an animal engaged in eating another with those of the animal being eaten. This is great. The inference is that for the animal being eaten, the pain is just ravaging and all-consuming. Yet for the animal doing the eating, it's really just a means of sustenance. It's not like the height of pleasure or anything. And so in this little duality here, we see that, if we were to draw a graph, the pain level is up here, the pleasure is down here, and therefore it follows from that our nature is more receptive to pain than pleasure. Schopenhauer continues to explore the wretched nature of man, but importantly, he doesn't really make any moral judgments about mankind. He doesn't say that mankind is bad because they don't do this. Rather, he accepts our condition and he understands it. Something which I think is quite admirable. Next, Schopenhauer asks us to consider a world free of suffering, just in a hypothetical sense. I mean, such a thing can't exist, we know that, but Schopenhauer wants us to think about it. As nice as this may sound, Schopenhauer says that there is something in the nature of man which will create suffering, and therefore such a world cannot exist. He writes, "The arrogance of men would expand, if not to the point of bursting, then to that of the most unbridled folly, indeed madness, if the pressure of want, toil, calamity, and frustration were removed from their life." There's a sad truth to this. Even if there was no externally imposed suffering, men would still be greedy, men would still be envious, they would fight each other for sport, etc., and the whole project would just go up in flames. Nonetheless, Schopenhauer is careful not to exaggerate the nature of man as though it's something totally unique. Instead, he identifies that our fundamental needs are precisely the same as our animal cousins, as dogs and insects and squids and the like. We just want food, we just want shelter. Pretty simple stuff, really. However, as a consequence of our intellect, it becomes a lot more difficult to satisfy these needs. This is most acutely seen in the fact that we perceive time in ways that other animals can't. Schopenhauer writes, "Everything is powerfully intensified by thinking about absent and future things." And so for us, suffering and grief can accumulate in a way that it can't with your average animal, because we can imagine things happening down the line, and that scares us. And so we build up these mental maelstroms, and there's really no way of overcoming that. Animals, meanwhile, don't have to deal with any of that. I love the way that Schopenhauer describes them as the present incarnate. That's the kind of expression I've been looking for a long time, so thank you, Schopenhauer. Now that he's explained how intrinsic suffering is to human existence, Schopenhauer takes up some of the ethical concerns that arise from this. He asks a rhetorical question. If the act of procreation were neither the outcome of a desire nor accompanied by feelings of pleasure, but a matter to be decided on the basis of purely rational considerations, is it likely the human race would still exist? So what he's saying is that if we were to really understand the amount of pain and suffering that every life contains, would we, as potential progenitors, people who can procreate, would we say, in fact, it's probably ethically better if I didn't produce any kids at all? I'm not sure if Schopenhauer was the first philosopher to think like this, as I have heard similar ideas echoed by others, but it's a pretty startling and confronting point. I mean, did our parents make a mistake when bringing us into existence? Who knows? And just a nice little quote which exemplifies Schopenhauer's pessimism. "The world is hell, and men are on the one hand the tormented souls, and on the other the devils in it." And he says that it is conceivable that this world was created as a kind of hell, as a place where we come to terms with some form of sin. This world is so overwhelmingly miserable that it makes sense to Schopenhauer that it was designed with our punishment in mind. As he writes, "As a reliable compass for orientating yourself in life, nothing is more useful than to accustom yourself to regarding this world as a place of atonement, a sort of penal colony." It's at this point that Schopenhauer starts to tie up his essay, and he leaves us with some ethical things to think about. He asks us to change our perception of the nature of this world. He wants us to regard suffering as something innate and something expected. He says, "When you have done this, you will order your expectations of life according to the nature of things, and no longer regard the calamities and torments of the world as something irregular." So basically, Schopenhauer is asking us to accept how bad life is. Schopenhauer finishes his essay on a note of compassion, which I really like because it proves that he's not just a cranky old man, he is a thinking individual and a feeling individual all at once. How's that? Once we all come to the jolly understanding that life is an expiation of the crime of being born, Schopenhauer says that we should all just try and get along with each other. Try and make life as easy as possible. It's going to be bad, that's the nature of it, but we can all view ourselves as being fellow sufferers on life's horrible, arduous road. Despite the nature of everything that's come before in this essay, Schopenhauer's last words could be found anywhere. He's advocating goodwill, simple as that. Tolerance, patience, forbearance, and charity, which each of us needs and which each of us therefore owes. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope that I'll be able to link this essay in the description for you to have a look at, and let me know in the comments what you think about Schopenhauer's theories. If you were on that path of philosophy and you had to make the judgment between this world being good and bad, which way would you go? I don't expect you to have an answer because I don't know myself. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Farewell.